On today's Locked On Giants podcast, 3 Giants we're not talking enough about so far in training camp. Lots of slots and practice takeaways from day 4, all coming your way next on Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Trena, and surprise, here I am. It's a Sunday. The Giants had a practice. Originally, I wasn't going to do a podcast until Monday, but you know what? I just couldn't do it. I couldn't leave you guys hanging. There's so much to talk about every day coming out of camp. And I said, I could save it for tomorrow, but why make people wait? Why do that to myself? So here I am with another weekend edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So those of you who are tuning in, thank you so much for doing so, making us your first listen of the day, or if you watch on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And on today's Locked On Giants podcast, I've got to cover a question that I know a lot of you have asked me, and that is some of the lesser names that we haven't been talking about here on the podcast, some of the standouts of, not named Darren Waller or Daniel Jones or Kayvon Thibodeau. Who are some of the guys that we're not talking about? So I'm going to give you 3 names that have really, stood out that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, that have kind of surprised a little bit. Then we're going to talk about lots of slots, because there was a transaction made today that we need to talk about. Actually, 2 transactions that relate to lots of slots. And then finally, we will wrap things up with some additional observations from Giants training camp. So all that on today's Locked On Giants podcast. Again, thank you for joining me on the show. We got stuff to do, so how about we get to it, huh? Okay. 3 Giants who not a lot of people are talking about, but probably should, and why. All right. So as I mentioned, this was a question that a couple of you sent in to me, and I'm going to give you 3 names of guys who have, I don't know if they're going to be starters per se, but they have really had strong starts to training camp. And the first one on the list is offensive lineman Tyree Phillips. Now, Tyree Phillips, if you have been following along and you're one of my everydayers, which, by the way, shout out to my everydayers and to my newcomers and everybody in between, I have often said that Tyree Phillips is probably the leading candidate to become the swing tackle. He could play left tackle, right tackle. Friday night, he was taking some left tackle reps for Andrew Thomas, who was getting a little bit of a breather. He stepped in for Evan Neal last season when Evan had the knee injury. So to me, it just looks like Tyree Phillips has kind of moved to the head of the pack there with regards to offensive tackle. And that means he's ahead of, like Corey Cunningham and Matt Peart. But here's the thing, why we should be talking a little bit more about Tyree Phillips, his versatility. So this is a guy who can not only play tackle, he can play guard. And lo and behold, guess what position he was playing today in practice on Sunday? Yeah, you guessed it, guard. And guess which side of the line he was playing in practice? Left guard. That's right, folks. The competition over at left guard just got a new candidate who threw his hat into the ring, Tyree Phillips. So Phillips took reps at left guard with the ones. He also, on the other night, on Friday night, he worked a little bit at right guard for Mark Lewinsky. Phillips's versatility, it is so clear that this guy has an inside track on being O-lineman number 6. Now, what's interesting about him doing work at left guard is that position is still unsettled. And you have heard me say many times that when the coaches have to rotate guys in, that means they're not really sure what direction they're going to go in. So, you look at the offensive line. Andrew Thomas is going to be the left tackle. Evan Neal is going to be the right tackle. There's some rotation going on at center, but I think at the end of the day, John Michael Schmitz is going to get that. And I'll talk about that a little later on in the podcast. Right guard, Glowinski will probably be the right guard. So that leaves left guard, where you've had Joshua Azuto competing, you've had Ben Bredesen competing, and now Tyree Phillips getting some snaps. So I just found that interesting. Other guys that could play guard include Jack Anderson and, of course, Shane Lemieux. I'm not so sure where they stand on the depth chart. There's not a depth chart officially yet, but, I'm sure the coaches have an idea of who's where in terms of the development. But Tyree Phillips, definitely a guy we need to be talking about. Now, normally I wouldn't mention offensive linemen because the pads have not gone on. They go on Tuesday. So I can't really sit here and tell you how well Tyree Phillips has looked, other than, for drills, when those drills have come close enough to the media area for us to see. But he's a guy I'll be watching, because he's just really gotten a lot more attention, I think, from the coaching staff. And, obviously deservedly so. So Tyree Phillips is player number one of the three guys that we're not talking enough about so far in training camp. Who is number two? We're going to go to defense. Jason Pinnock, safety. Now, what was interesting with Jason Pinnock is at the end of last year, I kind of suspected that the Giants might not be able to bring back Julian Love. It was just a hunch that I had. I knew Julian Love was going to hit free agency, and when they didn't get a deal done in the bye week, I said, I don't know if they're going to be able to bring him back. And as things unfolded in the offseason, it turns out, of course, they weren't able to bring him back, and he went to Seattle. And a lot of people asked me at the time, well, what happens if he leaves? Who's going to be the starter? I don't know if they're going to have a set starter per se. I think they could end up with a rotation. But ladies and gentlemen, Jason Pinnock is going to be one of those guys in the rotation if he continues to stay healthy. Now, during the spring, Pinnock had some kind of ailment. I think it was a shoulder issue. I know he had some kind of off-season surgery, and I want to say it was for his shoulder. So he really didn't do much in the spring, and I was kind of concerned that maybe he might start training camp on the PUP list, and he didn't. So he has come in, and I can tell you from the practices that I've seen when he's been in there, Kitts looks pretty good. So you've got a really tight competition for that other safety spot next to Xavier McKinney. You've got Pinnock competing for it. You've got Nick McLeod, who's competing for it. You've got Dane Belton, who is competing for it. Bobby McCain. That competition really is too close to call right now. It got a lot tighter. And I think that position next to Xavier McKinney, we're going to see a committee. I really believe that's the direction that the Giants are headed in as far as that second safety position. But of course, we'll see. It's still kind of early. And again, the pads go on Tuesday, and preseason is the following Friday, so we've got time yet. All right. A third guy that has stood out that we're not talking enough about, and this is a rookie. Defensive back, Trey Hawkins, the third. 6th round draft pick. Okay. Trey Hawkins has really looked good. Now he's taken most of his snaps with the second and third team defense, which is, okay. I mean, you're not going to start at the top. You got to work your way up. But some things I like about Trey Hawkins, he plays a sticky form of coverage, meaning he stays with the receivers on his hip. All right. So he'll travel with him down the field, doesn't really give up much in the way of, separation yardage. Trey Hawkins also does a good job, I think, in reading the just reading the play that's and how it's breaking and whatnot. So that's pretty impressive too. I just think also for a rookie, he doesn't get flustered too much. Sometimes rookies, if they get beat or they go the wrong direction, it's like, oh my God, and they get flustered. No, I haven't really seen that from Trey Hawkins. He recovers nicely, gets on his horse, as I say, and gallops over to where the ball is going. So, Trey Hawkins, I don't know that he's going to necessarily be a starter. I don't know that he's a lock for the roster, but I'll tell you what, through the first few days of training camp, this young man has kind of stood out in a good way. And it was, really good to see because, usually those day 3 picks, you don't really hear a whole lot about them. You don't really expect much from them. Trey Hawkins bringing it. So those are my 3 guys that we're not talking about enough. And I'll check, in the coming week once the pads go on. There'll probably be other guys that we're not talking about enough, but I did want to answer that question because I know a lot of you asked me that. All right, now coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast, the Giants suddenly have lots of slots. What do I mean by that? I'm going to tell you right after this. Hey, Giant fans, take your first swing at betting on Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to be hitting the first home run. All of that on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Want to thank you again for tuning in. It's the weekend, I know, but yesterday's show that I posted is doing so well. I hope today's show does well as in addition. So thank you for tuning in and your support of the Locked On Giants podcast. It is greatly appreciated. And before I get into the lots of slots segment of the podcast, just real quick, I got a notice from the Giants because I know some of you have also asked me this. When are the coordinators and coaches going to talk? Well, the Giants updated the schedule. That's going to be August 3rd, which is Thursday. So we'll hear from the 3 coordinators, T-Mac, Wink Martindale, and Mike Kafka. So they are going to talk on Thursday. And for the schedule, again, real quick, Giants practice on Monday. That's the final day of the acclimation period, the 5-day acclimation period. Tuesday is going to be a night practice. It's also going to be the first practice in pads. If you have an opportunity to go to Tuesday's practice, that's the one you want to go to, folks. Not just because it's a nighttime practice, but they're in pads. And that's where the closest thing to real football actually shows up. So just a little FYI for those of you who are thinking about going to practice. You do need a ticket to get in. Tickets are free, but I think they're sold out. But if you look on Twitter, sometimes you'll see license plate guys is giving them away, or some of the writers might be giving them away. If I come across any, I'll throw them on Twitter as well. But nobody's really come to me and said, "Hey, I've got an extra ticket. Can somebody use it?" So anyway, let's continue on with our programming for today. Lots of slots. All right. So what do I mean by that? The Giants announced on Sunday that wide receivers Sterling Shepard and Jameson Crowder were removed from the PUP list and the NFI list, respectively. Shepard, of course, was on PUP as he rehabbed from a torn ACL, suffered last year. I think it was week 4 of last year. And Crowder had been on NFI, which is the non-football injury list, with a calf ailment. So the two of them are off PUP. Off PUP and NFI. Also returning to practice after missing Friday's practice, Cole Beasley. Cole Beasley had been kneed in the quad, and he missed Friday's practice. So now, all of a sudden, the Giants have an abundance of quote-unquote healthy, or shall we say functional, slot receivers, hence the title, Lots of Slots. So how is this going to play out? What does this mean? And, just with Sterling Shepard, does he really have a chance to make the roster? So let's talk about the slot position as it stands now. Yes, when you look at the roster, the Giants have, I want to say 9 guys who can play slot, but they also have guys that can play slot that can also play on the outside. Shepard, of which being one. Paris Campbell can play slot. He can also play on the outside. Jameson Crowder is probably more of a slot guy, but I think he's taken a few, snaps over his career on the outside. So the point being is that the Giants have versatility at the wide receiver group, and it's just a matter of who's going to step up and grab the bull by the horns, as they say. Now, Brian Dable was asked about that. How are you going to sort through this whole, competition thing? And he said, look, it's competition. We always look for guys that, can separate, who can make plays. That's what it's going to boil down to. And, we know from the past that Sterling Shepard is capable of making plays. He's always been a favorite target of quarterback Daniel Jones. So we know he can make plays. Paris Campbell has made plays so far this summer and going back into the spring. Jameson Crowder, I don't recall him really standing out, back in the spring. So I can't comment on him just yet. And they still have Wan'Dale Robinson, who's going to eventually come off PUP, but probably not until the season, I would think, for Wan'Dale Robinson. But, this whole thing about having a gazillion slot receivers and a gazillion receivers in general goes back to one basic principle. That is matchup football. How many times have we watched this Giant team in the past and said, gee, this matchup between player X and player Y, really not a good one? Well, now that the Giants have more options at their disposal, assuming these guys are healthy, they can mix and match. And, we have seen some creative looks out of the offense back in the spring and also to the start of the summer. Case in point, the Giants had one play in Sunday's practice where I think they were on their 1 yard line and they bunched up and Daniel Jones was under center. And the only guy who was split out wide was Darren Waller. And Waller ended up being the target. We have seen in the spring, I remember reporting this, Darius Slayton getting some snaps in the slot. So really what the Giants are trying to do is they're mixing and matching. It's kind of like a canvas. If you're an artist and you just, and I speak from experience because this is what I do when I draw. You just throw everything on the canvas and you see what looks good and what doesn't look good. And what doesn't look good, you take off the canvas. So that's what the Giants are doing. And I think it's going to help them in the long run to play better matchup football, which is something that they have struggled with in the past. That is, now they do need everybody to stay healthy. So that's the caveat, obviously. Now, I mentioned Sterling Shepard because a lot of you are like, why did the Giants even bother to give the guy a roster spot? He's always hurt, blah, blah, blah. He's getting older. They drafted Jalen Hyatt. They added Paris Campbell. They added this guy. Why bring back Sterling Shepard? Folks, Shepard not only is the longest tenured Giant, which is besides the point, but he endeared himself to this coaching staff last year. He hung around during his rehab. He was a pseudo coach, if you will, in the locker room, a guy who was always there for his teammates. Sometimes there's a value, but not sometimes. I would say a lot of times there's a value to having an older, more experienced player on the roster. And, some of you say, well, great. So then make him a coach and don't take up salary cap space. Okay, but folks, Shep isn't taking up that much space. He's got a 1 year veteran minimum deal. The dead money from his last contract, I don't think is a cap choker. So what's the harm in giving the guy a chance? If he stays healthy, great. Let him go out of the game on his own terms, which is what he wants to do, and which I think he has earned a chance to do, to be honest with you. And if he can't, then you know what? You gave him an opportunity, and I think that's all anybody could have asked for, including Shep. So that is why Shep is still on this roster, despite the fact that some of you are like, enough with him already. Shep's a really good locker room influence. Can't say enough good things about him. So the Giants with lots of slots, we'll see how it shakes out. We'll We'll see if anybody settles in, but it's just really good not to have one guy that you constantly have to rely on. You have different guys who can maybe do little things that differently than their teammates, and that this coaching staff, knowing how creative they are, they can potentially exploit those little weaknesses against the opponent by mixing and matching. So it's going to be interesting to see how they actually do that when they line up finally for the regular season. We won't see much in the preseason, but we'll definitely see stuff in the regular season. All right, folks, coming up, takeaways from day 4 of Giants training camp. Do not go anywhere. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. The Giants practicing on Sunday, July 30th. So, you know what? Here I am with a show for you. Hope you are enjoying it. Some thoughts, some takeaways about day practice number 4. All right. I mentioned earlier John Michael Schmitz. I wanted to get back to that point. And specifically, I was talking about the rotating of offensive linemen and how sometimes that's a good indicator that they really don't know what they're going to do. I believe in the case of center, with John Michael Schmitz rotating in with J.C. Hassenauer, who, by the way, suffered, I think, an arm injury. I think it was his elbow today, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll see, what happens there. But, Bredesen has been, rotating in at center. There's the other side of the coin is that, you're giving these other guys snaps in case they have to step in, right? I think we could all probably agree that if John Michael Schmitz isn't the starting center, then something went wrong. But here's the thing, folks. Schmitz has yet to really be tested by an NFL defense. All right. That's going to change on Tuesday when the pads go on, because I'm telling you, and Dave will kind of confirm this without specifically mentioning Schmitz. Wink Martindale is going to throw the kitchen sink at this young man. All right. And rightfully so, because think about it. If Schmitz were named the starting center, you don't think Dan Quinn's going to do that and throw like all kinds of fancy blitzes and stunts and twists and all kinds of, creative stuff at the kid to make his head spin. So best they find out now, obviously in training camp, can Schmitz handle all that? So for the meantime, look, it's early in camp. The pads aren't on. What's the harm in giving, Bredesen some snaps there? Or, Hassenauer, when he was healthy, giving him some snaps there? Or, what was the harm? You get them ready just in case. So I did want to go back to that point because, a lot of people are like, well, what's going on there? Is it going to be Schmitz or, who's it going to be at center? I think it's going to be Schmitz, like I said, barring something catastrophic happening. So that's my take there. All right, some other practice takeaways, and I have just a few here. Jalen Hyatt, who started off training camp a little bit on the slow side, just, really wasn't getting a whole lot of action. He's been catching up and putting that speed on display. The coaches have been bringing him along kind of like systematically, a little bit more each day. So rather than just, have him explode out of the gate, suddenly making these great catches down the field, they've been building him up. And with that, they've been building up his confidence and his patience. So Hyatt rewarding them with a couple of really nice plays during the Sunday practice. Deonte Banks, I talked about him on yesterday's show. He's still struggling. But again, let's see what happens once the pads go on and you can now jam guys at the line of scrimmage. All right, let's see if that makes a difference for Deonte Banks. It's not time to panic. Did Banks get beaten a few times in practice? Yes, he has, going back to the first day of practice. But it's not time to panic yet, folks. Kid's going to be okay. He's going to have his hiccups, but I think at the end of the day, he's going to be all right. Daniel Jones, Anybody who's followed me for a while, you know that I am not a huge fan of quarterbacks who can run. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, but it's another element to the offense the defenses have to account for. I just don't like it because every time I see Jones run and then take a shot by a defender, you sit there and you go, please get up, please get up. Anyway, I get the impression that, this year, I don't think we're going to see Jones run for as many rushing attempts as he did last year, which was 120 in the regular season. I would like to see the Giants maybe cut that down if they can to about 75, which again, to me is just still too much. But look, you take advantage of his legs and, the zone reads and the RPOs and all that stuff. And, why would you cut your nose off to spite your face? It's kind of like, the whole thing with the punt returner. It's like you put your best guy back there, even if he's a Dory Jackson, which I don't want to see. And I don't think anybody else wants to see, but I understand the concept. Brian Dable, he's not coaching scared, folks. So whatever it takes to win is what they're going to do. From a passing perspective, Jones has been sharp so far. He and Darren Waller, I think I said it yesterday, but I'll say it again for those who missed yesterday's show. They look like they've been throwing together forever. And I made this comparison on an article that I wrote this morning for Giants Country. Waller is to Jones what Plaxico Burress was to Eli Manning. I mean, let's think about this for a second. Jones has never really had a legitimate number one skyscraper for a receiver. All right. Now, even though Waller is a tight end, he's still more of a receiver than he is a blocker. Jones finally has that. And we all saw, those of you who remember from 2006, 2007, when Plax came in, we all saw what he did for Eli Manning. And we all saw how Plax helped the Giants win their first Super Bowl in the Eli Manning era. Waller, I think, can have that kind of effect for Daniel Jones. Waller, obviously a little bit older than Plax was when he came over, from Pittsburgh as a free agent. I don't think we have to worry about Waller doing something foolish that will basically end his career the way Plaxico did. But just the chemistry that these two guys have is just really a sight to behold. And I think you're going to see a lot of highlight reel type catches from Waller and Daniel Jones. Just really, good stuff. And again, the creativity that Mike Kafka has shown in using Waller in the passing game, where he's had him lined up, be it in the slot, be it out wide, be it from the backfield. I mean, you name it, Waller has probably been there. So again, it comes down to matchup football, which I was talking about before, and how important it is and how much that was missing last year. Let me see. What else can I tell you? Darius Slayton, another guy you can't sleep on. I watched Darius Slayton, and the more you watch him in practice, the more confident he seems to be. And that's a good thing. Now, last year, we all know Slayton had some issues with the dropsies. I don't think I've seen him drop very many passes so far this summer. And thinking about it, I'd be hard pressed. I've looked through my notes. I didn't mark anything down, but I'd be hard pressed to recall one that I might have missed, So good on Slayton. I don't know necessarily if he's going to be a number one receiver for the Giants. I don't think so. But look, again, it comes down to matchups. And you just kind of get the impression with this coaching staff that having a number one receiver, a true number one receiver, while that person can obviously do damage for them, it's not as important as it is getting the right matchups and putting them into the right positions to make plays. So that's something to kind of, keep an eye on. The last guy I want to mention, and really, in retrospect, I probably should have mentioned him in the first segment when I talked about three guys that we're not talking enough about, but who are having good camps. And that's tight end Lawrence Cager. Now, at tight end, obviously, Darren Waller is TE number 1. Daniel Bellinger, TE number 2. Cager is making a really strong case to become TE number 3. Now, we haven't seen the blocking yet. Again, pads go on Tuesday, so we'll see how he does there. But Cager had a really solid day on Sunday. 4 catches, and I think he had a one-handed grab on a deep throw. So, as far as the Giants are concerned, obviously it depends on what are they looking for from that third tight end. Because, I do think we'll see some 13 personnel this year. We kind of saw a little bit of it, in the last couple of practices. But Cage right now, if he shows that he's more physical, that he can finish off his blocks, the Giants just might have something there, and how cool would that be to have another guy who basically they picked off the scrap heap come in and be a big part of what they're doing on offense. So good on Cager for progressing. I mentioned tight ends. Ryan Jones didn't practice on Sunday. He has some kind of, I think, a knee ailment. The only other tight end besides, Daniel Bellinger, who we know is a lock, is Tommy Sweeney. So Sweeney, I think right now, probably behind Cager in the battle for TE3. But of course, plenty of football still to come. And we here at the Locked On Giants podcast will bring you all the details, everything you need to know. So that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Giants. Again, the Giants will practice on Monday. So the plan is if there's a practice, I'll keep on bringing you a show. So I will see you all on Monday for a new edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Meanwhile, thank you again for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day, or watching on YouTube your first watch of the day. My name is Patricia Traina. Have a good one, Giant fans.